Hi, it's Rory Darkins here, and I'm really looking forward to presenting the upcoming live stream, Positive Sports Psychology, Cultivating Deep Wellbeing. In this live stream, we'll be covering what well-being is and how we measure it. We'll be looking at the links between well-being and sustainable high performance. We'll identify practical, science-based strategies to optimize well-being, and we'll have a Q&A in order to answer your questions to help you build deep well-being for yourself and others in your life. It's on Saturday the 10th of September and tickets are available now. Would love to see you there.
Hi everyone, my name is Jan Siversen. I am from Germany. I am the founder, owner, and CEO of Sailfish, a triathlon brand. And sports-wise, I hold the Ironman Hawaii swim record, which stands at 46:29 in 2018. And you're listening to the Physical Performance Show with Brad.
Failure is not an option.
I've had my ups and my downs.
Phelps with 10 meters left. 3 minutes too good. The crowd roaring. Freeman picks down.
I think it's an absolutely breakthrough experience.
Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, the show designed to inspire the pursuit of your physical best performance. I'm your host, Brad Beer. Listen in as we delve into how the world's top physical performers achieve their success, as well as the highs, the lows, and the journey of getting there. Let's get ready, set, let's go. Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, brought to you by Polar's stunning new generation running watches, the Polar Pacer and the Polar Pacer Pro, and our upcoming live stream event, Positive Sports Psychology, Cultivating Deep Wellbeing with Rory Darkins, coming up on the 10th of September 2022. I'm Brad Beer, sports and exercise physiotherapist by trade and training and founder of Pogo Physio. Each week we'll bring you the latest and greatest information and inspiration designed to help you perform at your physical best. And of course, we do this across a range of our different episodes, interest editions, expert editions, featured performers, learn-ins catch-up episodes, and coaches' corners. And today we are rewiring one of my favorite endurance-based running researchers, Dr. Rich Willy. Rich has appeared now twice on the Physical Performance Show, episode 74, and then again, episode 132, where we had a focused discussion on the needs of the Masters runner. And that's what we're putting the spotlight back on with this rewired episode of Dr. Rich Willy from 2018, where we explored the physiology, biomechanics, injury risk, and rehabilitation of the Masters running athlete. So get set with your pen and paper for the learnings from Associate Professor Dr. Rich Willy, the head of the School of Physical Therapy and Rehabilitation Science at Montana University, Missoula, USA. Dr. Rich Willy, welcome back to the Physical Performance Show, and we last caught up way back for an expert edition on episode 74, and due to popular demand, we thought we better get you back in the booth, so to speak, to share around your knowledge of all things Masters-related running. So welcome back, Rich.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Brad. It's wonderful being here, and really appreciate you taking the time to chat, and I'm excited to talk about some running injuries.
Rich, let's start with this big topic. It's certainly something I see a lot in practice, with my day-to-day, and that's the Masters runner. And so if we can purpose that a whole conversation today around the Masters runner. Firstly, what would you categorize as a Masters runner? Is there an age threshold, or does it start, at a certain point in life?
Yeah, I think a lot of it depends on, what the context is. Some elite level competitions consider the Masters athlete to be above the age of 35, but I think for the average runner, I think most of us would consider the Masters athlete to be above the age of 40.
Yeah, I think that's a good definition there, and it's certainly one I abide by. I'm still south of 40, Richard, so I'm happy to be classified as a young runner.
I'm on the other side, which is, I guess I'm 45 now, which I'm not quite sure how that happened, but but for me, it's given me some motivation to try to understand running related injuries and, running performance in the masters athlete a little bit, so I can apply it to myself. Certainly.
And to give some context, Rich, for your day to day, you're still actively, I really like that about your practice and your work. You're a proponent of what you preach, and that's, you're out there running yourself. Just put us a little bit in perspective of your life at the moment, because when we spoke last time, you've since transferred university. So what's life look like for Rich Willy at the moment?
Yeah, so I live in Missoula, Montana in the United States, and Missoula is, I would say it's an endurance sports mecca for sure. There's no shortage of endurance runners and cyclists and like ultra running is a really big sport here. We have some very high caliber ultra marathon athletes who live here in town, and we've got a sky running race, which is a global series, and it's kind of just as it sounds. It's a race like ultra marathons that kind of really emphasize a high vertical gain, and that's at a big ski resort a couple hours from here. But a lot of the race directors based out of Missoula and so forth. So there's a real big following for ultra endurance running here, or ultra marathoning, and for me, that's such a fun group to work with, because when those athletes come in and see us, they kind of, in my mind, are always kind of redefining what I consider to be reasonable or doable, across the lifespan, and they make it look quite easy. And I think that the way ultra marathoners kind of train, I think it's a good lesson that we can take, away as clinicians, that, if you build up to stuff slowly, the human body is really capable of quite a lot of workload.
Yeah, great. And Rich, professionally, what are you working on at the moment, paper-wise, research-wise? What are the top projects you've got on your desk?
Yeah, so I have two lines of research. The first one I do is I work a lot with tactical athletes, which I would consider to be members of the military, and also wildland firefighters. Here in Missoula, Montana, there's a big wildland firefighting base that's based near here, and so for us that's a big focus, and so it's a big area of where I'm trying to pursue some federal funding for support for the research agenda that we have here. The other line I have is looking at running related injuries, and I should say that a lot of injuries that tactical athletes get, so runners also get those. So stress fractures and overuse injuries of the knee, Achilles tendon injuries as well. So within running related injuries, I kind of look a lot at patellofemoral pain. I also look at some Achilles tendon injuries, and now that I'm kind of starting to shift some of my research agenda towards looking at the older runner, I'm starting to look at a lot of the injuries that older runners tend to get, which if you look at the literature, they tend to be a little bit different than what your average 22-year-old college student might get.
Well, let's go there, Rich. That's a great segue. What injuries do we tend to see for masters runners as opposed to non-masters runners, or we'll just go with younger runners? Yeah,
sure. So for the younger runner or the non-masters runner, the typical injuries that you're going to see with them, and a lot of it depends on which paper that you might read. They tend to be either patellofemoral pain or anterior knee pain. So a lot of people also call that runner's knee, and shin splints, also known as medial tibial stress syndrome. And those tend to be the types of injuries that you see more often with younger runners. But something really interesting happens in the masters athlete, and their injuries tend to shift. And if you notice, the injuries that younger runners get, they tend to involve bony injuries or articular joint injuries. But the masters runner, they tend to get many more soft tissue injuries, and so that would include muscle and tendon and so forth. And so their injuries tend to focus more on the calf musculature, the Achilles tendon, and the plantar fascia. So plantar fasciopathy, Achilles tendinopathy, calf strains are the injuries that you're going to see a lot in masters runners. There's also a little bit of difference in the injury rates too. Masters runners, they tend to get injured a little bit more, and within a given year, they also tend to experience more multiple injuries than the younger runner. And that's really not too surprising when you think about it, because the number one best predictor of whether or not you're going to get an injury is if you've had that injury in the past. And if you're a master's runner, you've probably been running for more years, and so you've kind of collected in your past history a bigger repertoire of previous injuries. So I think just by virtue of your running history, you're going to be a little bit more prone to certain injuries.
And so, Rich, the distribution of injuries does change, as you've outlined there. There's a greater risk of injury in a given year and multiple injuries as well. If we that could paint a fairly depressing landscape, I guess, for a Masters runner listening in, right? However, going back, what are the reasons why people should aim and aspire to continue to run through their decades into the Masters years, Rich?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's easy to kind of get focused on the little, and and I should say it's just a small difference in a greater injury rate in the Masters runner. It's basically looking at on average, when you look across studies, the younger athlete tends to get about 45% of all younger runners get injured on an annual basis, and that bumps up just a little bit. It just bumps up to about 50% in the Masters athlete. So I think it's worth keeping just that change rate in mind. But there are a lot of really good reasons. I mean, running is, when you look at the Masters athlete and running in particular, a lot of individuals who are scientists who study, healthy aging, they kind of say that the ideal aging model is the Masters runner. And so even when you look at like an older runner or a Masters runner, and you compare them to the non-runner who's of the same age, the metabolic cost of walking for that Masters runner is going to be less than the non-runner walking at the same speed. So if you're a runner and or maybe you're not a runner and you're walking with someone who isn't a runner, if you're that runner and your walking companion is a non-runner, chances are you're walking at a lower metabolic cost. I mean, it doesn't take as much energy for you to walk at a certain speed. So there are a lot of just regular benefits that carry over to just our overall kind of movement health, if you will. And of course, I mean, I think that running is such a great way to kind of reduce your risk of cardiovascular disease and some of the other kind of more metabolic issues that could, tend to pop up as we get a little bit older.
Yeah, certainly. And there's been, literature published that have looked at, the reduced rates of cardiovascular incidents for runners versus non-runners. So, all things aside, the cardiovascular benefits are enormous.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for sure. And that's going to, reflect also to, your preferred walking speed also. So that also will be a little bit higher in the endurance runner, and that we know as we get older is and when I mean by older is above the age of 65. Your preferred walking speed is coming out as a somewhat strong predictor of mortality. So faster walkers tend to live a little bit longer.
Well, that might mean I think I walk pretty fast, so I might live forever.
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously there's a finite limit to that, but yeah, I mean, and it's worth saying that relationship doesn't seem to really kick in until you get above the age of 65. But yeah, so I mean, I think that I think those things can be I think that's an easy sell, if you ask me, for maintaining a healthy and active lifestyle. It's not possible for everyone, of course, but if you are running, I think it's there and you're doing great. Fantastic, keep doing it. If you're getting a little bit older and you're starting to have some more running niggles, hopefully today we'll kind of talk about some things that you might be able to do to kind of head those off and when to go seek care from a medical practitioner and so forth.
Absolutely. And I think, a listener question came up, Rich, around from Shannon O'Hara. And I think this is a good time to pop it in. So we've spoken about the benefits, but then there's typically the naysayers or the people that just discourage people to run into their later years, citing concerns around the good old, running will wear out your joints, it'll wear out your knees. So what would you say from your research perspective to counter that myth?
Yeah, I mean, so I haven't done any work in this area, but others have, and there doesn't seem to be really any relationship between lifelong endurance running and your risk of developing knee osteoarthritis. And so in fact, you can even take that a little bit further, and that there have been some newer studies that have come out that are strongly suggesting that runners who participate in a moderate amount of running tend to have a lower risk of knee osteoarthritis than sedentary individuals. And so I think that makes sense when you think about it, because articular cartilage requires kind of systematic, kind of rhythmic loading for nutrition, because the way nutrition gets from the joint environment into your articular cartilage is more from this kind of cyclic loading that you were going to see more so with running. And so cartilage is going to stay healthy when it's being loaded in that manner. And then the other benefits of running are your overall inflammation is going to be lower. And your body mass is probably going to be a little bit lower. Your muscular qualities, as well as your other connective tissue qualities, tendon and so forth, are also going to be are going to be healthier. And so when you put all that stuff together, you're talking about articular cartilage likes to be used, and when you're doing something kind of very rhythmic like running, that's kind of that's really what it's designed to do. There's also a loading component to it too. When you compare running with walking, when you look at the amount of knee load per unit of distance. So let's say you go for a run and you're going to run 1 kilometer and you're going to walk 1 kilometer. The total amount of load on your knees is pretty much about the same between running 1 kilometer and walking 1 kilometer. And that's because when you're running, you're spending a lot of time in the air and your foot's not on the ground as long either. Whereas with walking, your stance time, or the amount of time you're loading your lower extremities, it tends to be a little bit longer. In fact, it's about 2.5 times as long as what it would be during running. So the overall load doesn't seem to be really a whole lot different when we compare endurance-paced running and just walking. So I think when you're looking at the perceived risk of knee osteoarthritis, that link doesn't really seem to be there when it comes to running. There are some caveats to that too that I think are worth adding, and that's that when we look at the elite runner, and we're talking like very elite and high volume runner, there seems to be a little higher risk of developing knee osteoarthritis in those individuals, the runners who are running at a very high level, but that doesn't really start kind of showing up until later on in life.
And what do you put that increased risk in the elite runner down to, Rich?
Gosh, that's a really good question. I think the elite runner is going to. I think their workload. I think if we compare that person to like the recreational runner, the elite runner may not have as much control over their workload. Meaning they might be coached by someone, they might be on a team, so they may have to get out there and get it done on days when maybe they've got some aches and pains. Whereas maybe the recreational runner, because they're not held to that kind of that external, and I guess standard, I guess you will, that maybe they're able to kind of be smart and back off when they're not feeling quite as good. Like outside of that, it's really hard to say like what are the reasons, but there does kind of seem to be like this little Goldilocks zone, if you will, that seems to be that moderate running just seems to be that nice sweet spot, and it seems to definitely lower your risk, and I would say maybe not necessarily that more is better, but certainly running is better than not running. Even
if you are a recreationally competitive runner or an elite runner, it's that's interesting. Rich, if we talk about the effects of aging beyond injuries as we run into our later years, what are the effects? I mean, obviously we all recognise that we tend to get slower, but why is that?
Yeah, so when you compare the older runner to the younger runner, there's some real distinctive changes in someone's running gait that's going to occur. And you mentioned already, you tend to slow down a little bit, so your overall running pace tends to tends to decline slightly. Also, your top end running speed tends to decline as well. And there's some really interesting reasons for that. First off, when you look at your VO2 max, so which is the max amount of oxygen that you can consume when you're at your peak workload, that tends to decline quite linearly with age, and that's a hard thing to kind of turn around. And that's not really my area of background. My area of background is more in biomechanics and injuries and so forth. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. But some things happen that are kind of a regular occurrence with aging, and one of those is that we tend to lose muscle mass, and that process is called sarcopenia. And so sarcopenia is something that happens to all of us. And we, not only do we lose muscle mass, we tend to get more fatty infiltration into the muscle, so the muscle quality is not quite as good. The cross-sectional area becomes a little bit less as well. We also have a reduction in the neural drive. So there seems to be a real neural component to the amount of force that the muscle can generate as we get older, and that's an important thing to think about too. It's not just the muscle's fault; the nervous system has a role here. Even though there's a very very tight linkage between the nervous system and our muscles. So there's that aspect, and when we look at it, where we tend to see the greatest decline in muscle force production is in our plantar flexors or our calf musculature, and that has an important consequence for the way we run, because the calf musculature is the largest contributor to the propulsive ground reaction force. So how much we're pushing off and when we're trying to push forward, and as a result, because our calf musculature is not generating as much muscle force when we're running, our step length tends to decrease too. So we tend to kind of take a little bit more of a shorter step as we age, and so as a result, we tend to kind of have a little bit of a higher cadence in the older runner. They tend not to push off again as much as I mentioned earlier from their calf musculature, from their ankles, and they over time they'll start to develop a little bit more of a shuffling type gait pattern. And there's some other things that happen too, that we don't tend to. A lot of times we think about stiffness, we think about it as being kind of a bad thing, or a layperson may, but really running stiffness is really important, or leg stiffness is really important, and that basically, if you can kind of imagine your lower leg or your whole leg as being like this giant spring, and your leg, that leg spring, becomes less tight or less springy as we age as well. And having a nice springy, lower extremity is a good thing, because that means we're going to store and release energy a lot more efficiently when we're running. And when a runner is aging, we tend to lose that leg stiffness. And one of the biggest reasons for that is we tend to have our Achilles tendon, and particularly, becomes less stiff. And so we also tend to lose not just some muscular qualities, but we also tend to have some loss of tendon stiffness, which is generally thought to be a very desirable trait in a tendon, particularly one that is being asked to store and release energy very efficiently.
Yeah, so I mean, there are the very real changes, as you mentioned: VO2 max, sarcopenia, less muscle size, dynapia, which is a new term, Rich, that neural drive reduction, and then as you've counted there, reduced stiffness in tendons. And at the recent La Trobe Running Symposium, you put a beautiful slide up, which, with your permission, we might pop up in the show notes, which was the slide that was titled "Plantar Flexors Take the Biggest Hit." And it was just a nice graphical depiction of the young versus masters runner and that reduced calf size. And the bottom of that slide, Rich, is loss of propulsive force minus 13% step length by the age of 60. So it's
it's a very real reduction, isn't it?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, definitely. And I should say that's from the age of 35 to the age of 60. We lose about 13% of our step length when we're running. That's some really, really great data that is coming out of Steve Messier and Paul DeVita's work. It was published about a year ago. But yeah, when you look at that, I mean, it's really being driven by it's the plantar flexors, the calf musculature that's really driving all that, and that seems to be that plantar flexor push off, that power is the biggest contributor to that loss of step length for sure. And if you're not taking as long of a step, I mean, that's going to be, unless you're increasing your cadence more so to take to take that into account, you're gonna start slowing down.
Yeah, and I mean, I think you share the terminology or the phrase at the running symposium around. That's why that shuffling gait. You do tend to see the masters runner, the more mature runner, tend to almost look like they've got some suction caps on their feet, as opposed to the 20-year-old runner that sort of bounds along down the road.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. So, if you have someone, so we're basically running, it's very similar to single leg hopping, and if you can imagine kind of single leg hop, so just standing on one leg and jumping up and down and stuff like that. The faster you can get off the ground and the less time you're going to spend with your foot on the ground, the stiffer that leg spring is going to be, and that carries over, and from a conceptual standpoint, very well to running. And so the faster you can get that foot off the ground, the greater leg stiffness you're going to have, and having higher leg stiffness is generally thought to be a very desirable trait, and it carries over to some running injuries too. And the big one being Achilles tendinopathy. We see reduced leg stiffness in individuals who have Achilles tendinopathy. So, and we also see reduced leg stiffness in older runners. And not surprisingly, the older runner is, particularly the older male runner, is going to be the person who's going to be at the greatest risk for developing Achilles tendinopathy. And that's because their plantar flexors and their tendon kind of loses the capacity, or loses some capacity for high training loads. And typically those training loads are not going to come necessarily from running a lot of volume, but more so from running fast and running up hills in particular.
You're listening to this Rewired episode featuring Dr. Rich Willy exploring the Masters runner. Support for today's show comes from Polar, the world's top choice in personal guidance for fitness, sports, and health. Polar recently launched two stunning new generation running watches, the Polar Pacer and the Polar Pacer Pro. Engineered specifically for running, the Polar Pacer and the Polar Pacer Pro are equipped with a variety of functions unique to Polar and providing personalised guidance and support across the entire runner's journey, from the first steps to the marathon and beyond. The Polar Pacer Pro, well, that's the watch for those who want to run better. It's one of the most powerful and sophisticated running watches ever built. It's ultralight with a high-performance core processor, including an extensive suite of advanced training tools that will help serious runners improve their running economy and performance. With built-in navigation and running power, it debuts at an incredible $499. The Polar Pacer, well, that's the watch for those who want to fall in love with running. It's an ideal running watch for those who are starting their journey as runners. It embodies the simplicity of running with all the essentials. The Polar Pacer, it helps runners get started at $299. So if you feel like it's time to beat your best, then jump over to polar.com to check out the all-new Polar Pacer range. Support for today's show also comes from our upcoming live stream event with positive sports psychology researcher and mental skills coach Rory Darkins. It's scheduled for the 10th of September, 3 to 6 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time. However, if you are outside of that Australian time zone and would still like to devour yourself of the teachings from Rory Darkins, then rest assured all registrants for the live stream will receive a post-event recording and a copy of the presentation notes via PDF. Tickets are available from $49 per registrant. Jump over to physicalperformanceshow.com/events. So if you're looking to increase your mental skills around your sports and performance, don't miss it. 4 modules, including a live Q&A with Rory. It's sure to be a hit. For now, let's jump back with Dr. Rich Willy, Associate Professor and Head of the School of Physical Therapy and Rehabilitation Science at Montana University, on this Rewired Expert Edition.
So, Rich, before we look at how some of these age-related declines can be minimised or, slowed, if you like, potentially, can we just explore this? It's a bit of a lead into exploring the running injuries of masters in more detail as well. But, this concept of a seesaw, if you like, with regards to running injuries, and, it's a nice visual for people that we want to try and balance the seesaw. And my own interpretation of the work that you presented at La Trobe University there was, it's almost like we've got loading on one side and our body's ability to deal with the load on another, or the capacity. And so can you put a few ideas around that concept? What are we trying to do at a very basic conceptual level to try and minimise running injuries, whether a masters athlete or a younger runner?
Yeah, so I think that, when you're talking about that kind of seesaw, you're basically talking about load capacity. And so as you mentioned, on one side of that seesaw is going to be like, the person's ability to tolerate training loads. And there's going to be a lot that's going to go into that. At the very local level, it's going to be tissue qualities, things like, like how strong your muscle is and how stiff your tendon is, and so forth. Globally, there's going to be some other things that are going to go into that as well, which is going to be, how well can you absorb that training load? And that's going to be things like stress and sleep and some of the things that maybe, as recently as 5 years ago, we didn't have a lot of appreciation for. But I think now, from a running research standpoint, we're starting to really view these things like this, how much stress you might have in your life as being pretty important. So that's on one side of the seesaw. And the other side of the seesaw is going to be applied training loads. So that might be, just basically how much you're running and the overall running training load. And there's a lot that goes into that training load, and that may be how fast you're running, the running terrain that you're running on. It may be how frequently you're running, of course, and also how far you're running. And so when that total sum of applied loads exceeds the tissue quality or the tissue tolerance for that load, we've basically exceeded the load tolerance for that structure or for that runner, and then an injury, might develop. And it's worth saying that none of these things are fixed. And so tissue quality or the person's ability to tolerate training load fluctuates from day to day. Again, life stresses play a major role. How recovered you are from the previous day's workout, those things can change too, and it also changes across the year based on our overall fitness levels. And so, basically, the way I kind of look at this is when someone develops an injury, how can we do two different things? We want to reduce the overall load slightly in the person, so we can, kind of reduce some of those abusive loads on the tendon or what have you, so that then we can build this person right back up and get them back to where they need to be and build that muscle up, build the tendon back up, and so forth. And there are a lot of different ways that we could do that. I would certainly say strength and conditioning is one of the best ways. So progressive resistance exercises and things like plyometrics and things like that can play a super important role. But when we do that, I think that when we as clinicians are working with patients, I think historically, and I know I'm certainly guilty of this in the past, that I've tended to underload patients. And when a patient comes in, they've got pain, I've tended to really reduce the amount of load. I've told them to kind of lay off running as much, and and so forth. And more so, now that we're starting to understand a lot more about tissue qualities and how it responds to rest and so forth. We're starting to know that rest for a lot of these soft tissue injuries, in particular, are really not a good idea. Stress fractures are a different issue altogether, of course. I mean, that's a pretty complicated injury. But when we're looking at soft tissue injuries, or even something like patellofemoral pain, those are injuries that don't do very well with absolute rest. So we really want to try to keep loading these individuals. And if there's any way that we can kind of keep this person running, that's great. Absolutely. And so there are lots of different tricks that we as clinicians have that can help a runner continue running. And also, if someone is having some pain and discomfort when they're doing their exercises, it used to be thought that was kind of a bad thing. But, I think that if we can work with a runner so they can kind of understand that is not necessarily a bad thing, and ways that they can kind of apply more load to themselves. And, I think the better off our runners are going to be.
So the seesaw, we want to overall as runners apply more load at all times because we're trying to run further, go faster. So we're putting emphasis on that side. We're all pretty good at doing that. However, Rich, strength training is one, if not the leading way to increase capacity or tissue tolerance or tissue quality, as you termed it, on the other side of the seesaw. So for a masters runner tuning in, what are the key things that they need to know around strength training, Rich? And, it can be a daunting prospect and, many pushbacks when it comes to the idea of incorporating that into a training week. So can you take us through why it's important? You've obviously already touched on the fact that we're trying to increase our capacity to deal with our running loads, but why is it important? How do we actually get started and start to integrate it?
Yeah, I mean, I think for clinicians and runners alike, I think one of the best concepts that people can get behind is that there's a lot more about getting strong than just being strong. So just because someone is a strong individual doesn't necessarily mean that they won't benefit from strength training. And so much so that I would almost even say that strength training is probably not even really the best term. And the reason for that is when we load tissues, there's this really neat process that is called mechanotherapy that occurs. And that's that when you load muscle, it's you're going to get muscular hypertrophy. But when you load bone, you're going to get bone remodeling. When you load tendon, you're going to get collagen synthesis. Ligament, you're going to get collagen synthesis too. You load articular cartilage, you're going to get the quality of that articular cartilage is also going to improve. And so, strength training is such a great way to accomplish a lot of those things. And I know that, a lot of runners may be thinking, well, I'll just run. But the interesting thing about running is that while it's a really great activity for cardiovascular conditioning and so forth, it seems to be too high of a repetition activity, and to really generate or stimulate the nice changes in tendon quality and connective tissue qualities that we see with strength training. And a large part of that is that when you contract a muscle or you load a structure when you're running, that structure is actually not loaded for very long at all. It's a kind of a your muscle contracts and then it relaxes. Whereas when you strength train and you go into the gym, and let's say you're doing a nice slow knee extension machine, or a knee extension exercise, and you're on the knee extension machine, and you're raising the weight for 3 seconds, and then you're lowering that weight back down for another 3 seconds. You've created an environment for that muscle, the quadriceps, and the quadriceps tendon, the patellar tendon, your patella, which in your articular cartilage is associated with that, and everything else in that area, and the bone that those tendons are connected to, where those structures are under tension for 6 whole seconds, and for 6 straight seconds, and that's the kind of stimulus that our connective tissues seem to respond to the best.
So that's doing repetitions of exercises, 3 seconds up, 3 seconds down.
Exactly. Yeah. And if you think about that, it's going to take you so many. Your foot's on the ground for about a quarter second when you're running, of which your quadriceps, you only really get to your peak quadriceps contraction for just a very, very small portion of that 250 milliseconds. So probably about 20% of that stance cycle. So when you add up, it's going to take you a lot of foot strikes to get the same amount of total tension, or total time under tension, as you would from just doing one repetition on the knee extension machine. So it's just a way more efficient way to load our extremities. It seems that our connective tissues really like that kind of loading. They respond really well to it. I think that when you're looking at the athlete who is trying to recover from a soft tissue injury, in particular tendon injuries, there's no better way to do it than kind of this idea of slowly loading these structures with heavy weight.
And you referenced in episode 74, and if you've missed that one, jump back and listen to that one where, Rich, you took us through the concept of isolated exercises, single leg. It doesn't need to be fancy. The dynamic, clean and jerk type exercises. These can be as simple as seated leg extension, calf raise work, hamstring curls. Rich, in terms of getting into the gym, we need to lift heavy, as you've referenced, but it's okay, isn't it, to start with a few weeks, a month or thereabouts, or longer, with some slightly lesser loads in terms of weight and greater reps initially. What would you suggest there for the runner that has never set foot inside a gym?
Yeah, I think if you're new to weightlifting, I think first and foremost, I think you probably need to get hooked up with a personal trainer or someone who really knows their way around the gym, who can help you out with learning how to lift properly and use the machines appropriately and so forth. And if you have an old injury, I think one that's particularly problematic, like a persistent lumbar, some low back pain or something like that, that individual can really help you kind of design a strength training program that will kind of maybe help that, but hopefully will at least not aggravate it. But with that said, I think if you're good to go and you're wanting to start on a strength training program, I think a good way to do it is to start off with fairly high repetitions. So we're talking like 2 sets of 15 repetitions, a couple times a week. I think that's a great way to do it, because when you're doing that, you're basically just going through the motion, and there's a lot of nice things that are still occurring, and this should be pretty easy 15 repetitions when you're doing that. But once you get past that initial month or so of doing that, and this accommodation to that new training program, just like anything, whether it be running or strength training, will start off kind of slow. Your goal should be to start getting down into fewer and fewer repetitions while you're increasing the amount of weight that you're lifting. And ideally, you kind of want to start getting yourself down to maybe start off in week 1, 2, and 3 at doing 15 repetitions, and maybe by week 4 you want to start getting yourself down to around 10 repetitions with a higher weight. And then after that, you kind of really want to change gears. You want to really start looking at getting down to maybe 4 sets of 8 repetitions for the next couple weeks, and then down to 3 sets of 6 repetitions, and 4 sets of 6 repetitions with some higher weight, even more so. And that probably seems very counterintuitive, because I think a lot of runners and a lot of clinicians often prescribe like a high repetition strength training program. But when you look at the evidence, unless you're lifting a weight that is difficult to lift for at least for no more than 10 repetitions that you can do with that weight. If you're lifting weight that is higher than that, or that is easier than that, and you're getting higher reps than 10 repetitions, what happens is that it doesn't seem to be enough load to trigger some of the desired changes that we like to see in connective tissue and tendon in particular. We don't see the increase in tendon stiffness, and when we're starting to lift with greater than 10 repetitions per set, you really only start to see those nice changes in tendon as we get as we get a little bit lower repetitions. So 6 to 8 repetitions is where it seems like the evidence is really pointing us toward.
And to the runner that would be concerned that they were going to bulk up, what would you say to the runner with that concern? Yeah,
it doesn't seem like that really kind of shakes out when you look at the literature. I mean, it seems like this idea of lower repetitions. There's a lot of stuff that makes us strong than us just adding on muscle bulk. There's a very strong, or not strong, but very important neural component to strength. So how our nerves are recruiting muscle fibers and so forth is also a large part of how we gain strength. But the other part of it too is if you're participating in regular endurance training at the same time that you're doing weight training, there seems to be a bit of this interference effect that somewhat prevents us from, or doesn't entirely prevent us from gaining muscle mass, but it seems to kind of ward off a large part of that. And our overall body mass tends to tends to stay about the same or even reduce with the strength training program, but you do get some increase in localized muscle mass with strength training. It's not, of course, not as much if you're not also endurance running, but those are changes that you want to see. I mean, those are things that are really important. And I think when you look at elite athletes too, I mean, I think that's a really big change that you see in middle distance athletes and triathletes and so forth, is that, now it's like, it's just like a triathlete. They do 4 sports, and weight training is one of them. And I think 2 decades ago that really wasn't the case at all. So there's a big important reason why these elite athletes are doing the strength training, and that's because it really does improve performance, but it also seems to reduce one's overall risk of developing an overuse injury. Yeah, great. And before we move off strength training, Rich, just a couple of really practical questions. Recovery time between, if you're in the gym, you're doing seated leg extensions, slow reps, 3 seconds up, 3 seconds down over time, pushing, solid loads there. What's the recovery time? Is it okay just to do the right side and then go back to the left, or do you specify a specific recovery time? Yeah, I mean, I think generally, you should be doing 2 to 3 minutes of rest. When you look at the literature, that's like, where are we seeing the greatest gains in muscle strength and so forth? It seems that 2 to 3 minutes of rest in between each set is going to be ideal, and performing these exercises 2 to 3 times per week is also ideal. I think when your training loads are very high, so like in the competitive season and so forth, I think a lot of athletes will drop down to doing more of a maintenance program of maybe once per week. But when your overall running loads or running training loads are kind of on the low side, like in the off season or preseason, that's a good time to be hitting the gym 3 times per week. For sure. And there was one other thing. You asked a question earlier, I didn't quite get around to answering, and that was, should you be doing isolated joint exercises or should you be doing multi-joint exercises and so forth? I would say that they're both important, but understand that if you're on a single joint machine, like a knee extension machine, you're going to be able to load that quadricep and load that patellar tendon and load that articular cartilage with greater weight with a knee extension machine than if you're doing a single leg squat with weight. So if you're trying to do what a lot of folks would consider to be a functional type exercise, doing a single leg squat, basically what you're doing is you're splitting that workload between your ankle, your knee, and your hip. And also on top of that, because you're doing it in a single leg, you're having to also work on your balance. And because you're also trying to maintain your balance, you're not going to be able to lift as much. And so being on a machine that just takes all that load and focuses it on one muscle group where you don't have to worry about falling over, you're going to be able to deliver a lot more resistance stimulus to that joint and associated muscle with greater efficiency on the machine or the single joint exercise. Great. Rich, where should a masters runner incorporate their running around their gym sessions? So they've got we've adopted the idea that we need to strength train until death do us part, but where to fit it? Do we run after a gym training session or a resistance session? Do we have the day off after gym training? What would be your suggestions? Yeah, Rich Bladgrove, he's from the UK, has done some really neat work in this area and kind of synthesized a lot of literature. And it seems like there's some ideal ways to do that you should have a couple hours in between your running session before you strength train, or vice versa. So there's some ideal ways to do this from a timing standpoint. Generally speaking, though, I think a lot of the runners that I end up working with, they only get one crack at it, and so they maybe need to do strength training and then go for a run or whatever. So I think the emphasis should be, like, as far as timing throughout the day, what's going to work the best for you. So for me, I mean, the last thing I want to do when I come back from a run is do some strength training. And so as a result, I'll do my strength training maybe before I go for a run. Now, with that said, the other thing to really keep in mind too is that when we're looking across a week, I think it's really important for runners to make sure that even though we're getting a little bit older, or what have you, or maybe you're not even training for a race, it's still so important to maintain an easy hard kind of cycle throughout the week. And strength training also plays a really important role in that too. So if you run hard let's say you run easy on a Monday after your long run on a Sunday, and then you go to the track workout on a Tuesday, and then on Wednesday you hit the gym and you lift really heavy in the gym. What's happened there is that then you've placed 2 hard days back to back. The Tuesday day was the track day, and Wednesday was the heavy day in the gym. And then let's say then on top of that, then you do a tempo run on Thursday or have you, then, or maybe a hill repeat. Then you've got 3 hard days in a row where you're basically applying a like maximal or near maximal stimulus to your musculature and to your connective tissues on a back to back kind of schedule. And that doesn't make a lot of sense when we realize that we get stronger and our muscles get stronger and our tendons get stronger when we're resting. And so when you look at the recommendations that a lot of tendon experts are currently making and so forth, and I would definitely adhere to this too, is that put your strength training on one of your hard days, so that your hard days are hard and your easy days are really easy. And what I mean by hard days, I mean that's maybe the day that you do your track workout. So maybe that would ideally look like you're going to strength train in the morning and then do your track workout in the evening or something like that. And maybe just from a practicality standpoint, those two sessions need to be closer together. But then your next day should be super easy, just light jogging or something like that. So you give everybody or all your structures, this chance to recover from that applied workload.
And I mean, I've been thinking about this and implementing changes to my practice since you presented on this at the La Trobe Running Symposium, and even with, masters runners or non-masters runners recovering from tendinopathies or bony injuries, I've compounded their running with their resistance days together, and in many cases giving them a complete rest day the next day, or something very light and easy if they need to be out there. And I think overall it's probably made a positive change in some of those runners' outcomes that are rehabilitating injuries.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah. No, for me, it's the same thing. I think about where I really kind of started latching onto this was when I started looking at how I was doing my return to run programs with a runner who was injured. And I'd have this runner who maybe had Achilles tendinopathy or something like that, enough that it really took them out of running for a while. And then I was having them, return to running. A lot of those are going to be walk-run programs where they're maybe doing a walk-run session on a Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And, even though the overall workload is low, it's actually relatively high for that individual at that given point. And so they're really stressing themselves. But what I was making a mistake of then doing their strength training, because I still want them to be doing resistance training exercises as they continue throughout their progression and so forth. I want them to continue doing the strength training even once they're done with me. I was having to do their strength training on the non-running days, and I just felt like when I made that change, like what you just described, to add the strength training on the same day that they were doing the running on these return to run programs, it made a world of difference for the runner as far as their ability to tolerate and try to get back to they're running in a relatively seamless manner.
And the role of walking, Rich, that can be quite underestimated, but quite useful.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that runners, they really like to run, and I think runners, I think that a lot of runners I know have a tendency to undervalue the importance of walking. And as I mentioned earlier, the knee joint load, the amount of the cumulative load that's being applied to the patellofemoral joint or your tibial femoral joint when you're walking over a given distance, the cumulative load is really not a whole lot different than running. So let's say you're a runner who's injured and you can't tolerate running, but the most important thing for you probably to do is keep active, keep moving, keep walking, and I highly recommend using a step counter. And think about running not so much when you're recovering from an injury as how far you've run from a distance standpoint, or how long you've run from a minute or duration standpoint. But think about it more in a load cycle, and load cycles mean steps. How many steps are you taking? And so when you look at the average return to run program that's out there, and ours being one of them, on day one of that return to run program, they're doing 1 minute of walking and 3 minutes of running, or some version of that, and they're doing like say six or seven repetitions of that. So it doesn't sound like a lot because they're only really running for 7 or 8 minutes total over the course of a 30-minute session.
Yeah.
But when you add up the number of steps they take, it ends up being about 4,000. So if that runner has been doing nothing but kind of getting through their days and maybe getting 4,000 steps in, and then suddenly they start doing this return to run program, they've just doubled the number of loading cycles on their lower extremities on day one of that return to run program. So really, running is great, but man, walking is the foundation and the basis for really all of our movement patterns.
And as you say, runners, we like to run. So therefore, that when the partner wants to go for a walk, it might not be such a bad thing after all.
No, yeah, absolutely. I think it's great. And, one of the places too, living in Missoula, where I live in the mountains, and that's one of the things I've really learned to appreciate is that, there are a lot of runs I go on where I gotta do some walking, and because it's just the inclines are so much. And, as a runner, you think, gosh, I can't stop running. I got to keep running up this hill. But the reality is that walking is just as fast on some of the trails that I run on. And there's really no shame in walking. In fact, if you look at some of the fastest trail runners in my area, they spend a lot of time getting really good at walking.
The fight against the reduction in calf musculature strength and propulsion. You've cited before that 50% of our propulsion tends to come from below the knee. So we're trying to combat that as we mature as runners. Just very practically, in the gym environment, what would be your go-to exercises there? And is there any benefit if, just for whatever reason, Rich, someone's on the road, they can't get to a gym, what would you suggest they could be doing at home to help their calves?
I think just to reiterate that point, the calf musculature is so important to the older runner, and it's really important for all runners because it really contributes about 50% of our total support moment when you compare it to the knee and your hip musculature. But if you were to ask me, what's the one exercise the masters runner should do, it would be a single leg calf raise, where maybe they're holding on to like a door frame for balance, and doing some heavy weight. So holding a big dumbbell, or if you're on the road, just throw some weight into a backpack and do some single leg calf raises. Try to make sure that, if you haven't done it before, that you're starting off with 15 repetitions, a couple sets. But once you're able to tolerate, look at having enough weight in that backpack that it's a struggle for you to get more than 8 repetitions per set, and then you're doing 3 to 4 sets of that a couple times a week.
Yeah, great. So there is some utility in, if you're not in the gym, you can still do something to help at home.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't even belong to a gym. I've got some adjustable weights at home and some dumbbells that I use, and I feel like I can kind of get it done there. I don't think you need anything really special, and you can go to like a secondhand store or like a garage sale or something like that, and pick up a pair of dumbbells pretty cheap, and that's going to be really all that you're going to need.
And in terms of isolating things like quadriceps, and can you achieve that well at home, or is that where you really do need to get into the gym, into a leg extension, etc.? Yeah,
that's going to be a little bit tougher, to do for sure. I think. The knee extension machine is really, really the best way to do it. But, you still can really load your quadriceps. You can really kind of target them, well, by doing like a step down exercise. So if you've got a step and you're stepping down, you're using you're coming down with your other leg and you're just kind of tapping your heel on the ground and then bringing yourself back up while you're holding onto a weight. It's going to really load your quadriceps in a very high manner, and it doesn't use your hip extensors very much, as long as you keep your trunk upright. If you start to lean forward, that's going to start engaging your hip extensors a little bit more. But doing that single leg step down is a great way at home to really load your quadriceps. You're going to get some calf contributions there too, but it's not as good as being on a knee extension machine for sure, but it's certainly a good way to get it done.
It's something. And with the calves, important to incorporate straight leg work and bent leg work, right, Rich, to target the deeper part, the soleus, which is often the forgotten cousin.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you think about your gastrocnemius musculature, and they're kind of the nice, kind of sexy looking calf muscles. But the reality of it is that the soleus that's underneath it really represents about 68-70% of the total muscle mass of the calf musculature. And so you've got this giant muscle down there that we often don't think about. And because it doesn't cross your knee joint, the best way to isolate that muscle is to do calf raises with a bent knee. And so it seems like if you can bend your knee about 60 degrees or so or more, you're really going to be able to isolate. So like a seated calf machine or seated soleus machine at the gym is really the best way to get it done. At home, you can do it a little bit. You can kind of do that single leg calf raise with a bent knee. You're still going to get some gastrocnemius contributions there because you can't bend your knee to 60 degrees typically when you're doing a single leg heel raise. But if you bend your knee some, you are going to shift more and more load over to that soleus muscle, and that's really what you want to kind of focus on.
Yeah, don't forget the bent knee version. Rich, just want to ask you around the masters runners. I observe a real proclivity in many runners to gravitate towards such a big area, shoes that are maximalist design, your Hoka One or, the more recent additions to the running shoe marketplace. This is something that I know you pay great attention to in your research. So, is there any merit in a masters runner going and picking up one of these maximalist shoes as opposed to a more traditional type shoe?
Yeah, so when you talk about shoes, I guess we can kind of divide them up into three different types of shoes. You got your standard running shoe that you're going to see in a running shoe store, and then you have your minimalist shoe, which is just like it sounds, and your maximalist shoe, which is going to have a lot more cushioning to it and so forth. There's more difference between the standard shoe and the minimalist shoe than there is in the standard shoe and these Hoka shoes or these maximalist kind of shoe you're looking at. So there's not as much difference there. So for the runner to make that transition to running in a maximalist shoe is not going to be as much of a change for them. A lot of older runners that I work with really kind of swear by these maximalist shoes. And I don't think we really understand yet how they change loading on the lower extremity. But I do know that a lot of older runners, they tend to lose, they get some, the fat pad that's on your heel tends to atrophy a little bit as we get older. And also, the cushioning that you have on the bottom of your foot, the fat cushioning you have down there tends to also reduce a little bit too. So a lot of these runners really like these Hoka shoes because they tend to kind of reduce some of the loading that's right on the plantar surface. And if that's going to keep that person running, I don't have a big problem with that. Where I think like maybe you can go a little bit wrong is if you're an older runner and you're running in a standard shoe and then you decide to run in a minimalist shoe, you have to be ready for the change in the calf loads that are going to occur. And I think that's a much bigger jump for the older runner to make than to move from a standard shoe to one of these maximalist or highly cushioned shoes.
Yeah, absolutely. So the take-home point for footwear selection for the masters runners is just be cautious if you're going towards a minimalist. Otherwise, you're pretty safe.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think a good way to look at it is like, I was like an early adopter of the Nike Free when it first came out. I bought the Nike Free 3.0, and way back, I think it was in like 2005 when they first came out, and it came with an instruction manual, and the instruction manual told me like how to ease into the shoe, and it had a nice schedule and all that stuff that I think was like 8 or 10 weeks long on how to ease into running into the shoe, and you still see that in some of these minimal shoes. They'll give you guidelines on how to do that, but when you buy like a maximally cushioned shoe, they don't come with a sort of instruction manual, and there's a reason for that, and that's I think that runners aren't getting themselves in trouble in these types of shoes.
Yeah, so interesting. Rich, we're approaching the end of our time today, but I think let me ask you this: what would you say if you had to boil everything down, which is impractical and impossible, but I'm still going to throw it to you, to one piece of advice, if you could only give one piece to the masters runner, what would it be to help them stay out there enjoying their running, injury-free, performing at their best?
Oh, one piece. That's a good question. I would say strength train. Yeah, absolutely. Resistance train, for sure. And get in the gym and do it regularly. I think the overall health benefits extend far beyond running. And I think those things are hard to deny. But the fact that strength training also will and head off some of the muscular changes that we see with aging and so forth, I think it's just you need to do it. I think for sure. If I can get one other piece of advice that I would give,
of course.
I would say with your running, avoid running the same pace every day. And if you can, ease into it, of course, be very slowly, but still, even if you're not targeting a race, pick one day a week to make a pretty intense session where you're doing some speed work or you're doing some hill repeats, something that's going to challenge, from a running standpoint, challenge your plantar flexors when you're running outside of the weight room. And so something on top of that, I think those two things, and I know I'm kind of cheating by giving two things, but I think those two things are going to be the most important things that you can do.
So mixing it up and adding intensity is really, really critical for helping to reduce some of that age-related decline in strength and stiffness of the tendons, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and a collaborator of mine, Max Paquette at University of Memphis, has done some really neat work with this, and he finds that runners who tend to run a little more with a little more intensity, they tend not to demonstrate some of these same declines that we see in step length and reduced ankle power during running. So that's a hard thing for me to say that that's not important. So I think, maintaining some intensity on an occasional basis, once a week at least, I think is a good way to do it.
Which is great, because there can be a real aversion, for the Masters runner towards speed and getting stuck in that middle cruisy pace, I guess, which is relative for all of us. And I've even heard you reference mixing up your running routes. Don't run the same route all the time, which at the moment I'm guilty of.
Oh yeah, me too. I mean, when I've got the time is tight, I tend to jump into a run that I know exactly to the minute how long it's going to take to do. So yeah, for sure.
No, fantastic, Rich. I didn't ask you. Sorry, back on episode 74, the personality question, and expert editions. Everyone likes to know a little bit about the personality behind the expert. 3 people at a dinner table for Rich Willy, living or past. Who would be at your table and why, Rich?
Oh, well, yeah, this is, I guess the low-hanging fruit would be Bernard Lagat. I know you had him on your show a while ago, but I think he's just a fascinating athlete. He's a Masters track runner, and how he's been able to kind of keep it together, I think and still remain at just the top of his game is amazing. I'm a cyclist from at heart, so Greg LeMond I think was a childhood hero of mine, so I think sitting down with Greg LeMond would be pretty cool too. And then Peter Cavanaugh, he is the grandfather of running biomechanical research, and my PhD advisor Irene Davis actually got her PhD under Peter Cavanaugh, but I'd love to sit down and chat with them at some point. So yeah, those would be the 3 individuals for sure.
Well, it's a fascinating table, and we had Bernard Lagat on only a few episodes after your last appearance on the show, Rich, with your expert edition. And one of the things I loved about Bernard's approach was, as you reference, he's such an inspiration for so many with what can be achieved with running across the lifespan. But he just refused, he said, to ever contemplate the idea that any of his performance was due to his age, that he's old. He just doesn't have it in his vocabulary. And I think there's so much to take from that in terms of a mindset and a perspective around our activity levels as we mature, all of us.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think there's a chicken or the egg thing. Do we start running like an old person because we have to, or vice versa? So yeah, I think he's a real inspiration for sure.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Rich. Finally, the physical challenge for the week. Let's make this specific for the Masters runner. So, what's Dr. Rich Willy's physical challenge to the Masters runner for the week going to be?
Go to the gym and start doing some calf raises.
Awesome. Rich, thank you for your time. It's evening time there in the town of the University of Montana or Missoula. So thank you for your time. And there is so much more. I think we might have to make you an annual fixture on the Physical Performance Show as an expert.
Oh, thanks, Brad. No, it's been a pleasure. I really enjoyed being on the show.
So there you have it, another episode of the Physical Performance Show, and I trust and I know you enjoyed. If it was your first time, some learnings from Dr. Rich Willy, or if it was some revision, I know it still will have been incredibly useful. Now, Rich has had a huge influence on my professional practice as a sports physio. You'll find Rich over on Twitter at rwilly, WILLY 2003, the numerics, and also one of my favourite Instagram accounts, Montana Running Lab, over on Instagram. Whilst there, consider a podsy. That's a screenshot of the episode of the show you've been enjoying at any moment in time and tagging in the show at Physical Performance Show. We'll reshare those. They are always a whole lot of fun to see them coming through. If you have any feedback regarding the show, feel free to shoot it across to myself over on social at Brad_Beer. Perhaps it's a guest recommendation or some way of optimising the show. Massive thanks to the great folk who make this show possible each and every week. Daryl Misson, audio engineer, Susan Wilkin, show administration, Matthew Olding, show graphic design, and Milan Borrow, videography. If you're yet to follow the Physical Performance Show over on YouTube, check out the YouTube channel. It's full of video episodes of each of our guest recordings and also mini snippets from interesting takes from the guest share-ins. If you'd like to support production of the show, you can do so practically from just $5 per month by jumping over to physicalperformanceshow.com, and there you can click the Patreon tab. Podcasts, while free to enjoy, are certainly not free to produce, so thank you to our patrons and anyone that would like to practically support the show. Now, coming up, we have a smorgasbord of highs, lows, and learnings coming your way. Featured endurance athletes, some wonderful upcoming expert editions, looking at continuous glucose monitoring, rheumatology in sport, and a whole lot more. So until next week, keep pursuing your physical best performance. I'm Brad Beer, and this has been the Physical Performance Show.